This podcast is a project of the Medina Focus with the goal of providing space for collaboration and community among practitioners to the Muslim diaspora in North America. As people around the world have immigrated to the West, many Christians have realized that they live and work in the midst of the nations, and they often feel alone and unprepared to communicate cross-culturally. If you are looking for conversation and community surrounding issues of loving Muslim friends in Jesus' name, we welcome you into the conversation.
Hey everybody, my name is Brian. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad that you are tuning in. We have a really interesting guest today. We always have really interesting guests. I don't know why I say that every time. I remember a few years back, I guess, oh man, I'm getting older. It must be probably about a decade back. A man named Eric Geiger wrote a book called Simple Church. And in this book, he says some very unorthodox things. He talks about his church experience, which is very unorthodox, where he was able to cancel VBS. Now, if you go to a traditional church, imagine trying to cancel VBS. But his premise of the book is he makes an analogy between Google and Yahoo, and so we're all internet users here. So if you go to Google's page, there's 30-something words on the entire page, top to bottom. In view, probably 15 to 20. Go to Yahoo's page, it's everything. And his point is Yahoo doesn't know who they are, or they don't display it in a way that's accessible. Whereas Google, nice, clean, we're a search organization, but then they have mail and everything else that you could want. It's just you have to know where to go. And so he compared that to the church, where oftentimes churches, if we don't know who we are and what God has called us to do, we wind up doing a little bit of everything. We have trouble sacrificing programs. I think that's a common ministry thing, not just in church life. For us in diaspora ministry, it's also hard. We spend years of time, labor, putting out the vision, raising money, getting volunteers, and then the program may or may not work. The program may or may not give us the results we want. And so what do? It's important to take time and sit back and reflect. Today's guest is going to talk a little bit about that from the conversation I've had with him. I think he demonstrates a lot of flexibility, and we can learn from this. And so maybe that will be the lesson for many of us today is how do we listen to those that we serve? How do we serve other people who serve alongside us? And how do we really listen and follow the Holy Spirit on when do we open something and when do we close something? How do we adapt our ministry to the changing world? Because for what we're doing, our world is changing so fast that we're dealing with people who are on the front of that change. If you're listening to this call, you may know Syrians, Somalis, just name the refugee group that are on the cutting edge of the news stories that you're seeing. And so because our world changes fast, sometimes we have to adapt. And so how do we do that with intentionality and precision? These are good lessons for us to learn. And so my guest today is Ryan. He served as a linguist with Wycliffe Bible Translators for 9 years. He worked with a previously undescribed language in the country of Papua New Guinea. In 2017, he returned to live in the U.S. He founded the Refugee Language Project, which is a nonprofit organization based out of Amarillo, Texas. For those not familiar with Texas, that's way up in the Panhandle. Ryan holds a PhD in linguistics from James Cook University in Australia, and he and his wife Crystal have 3 kids, and they live there in Amarillo, Texas. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Glad to be here.
So I see that you were in Papua New Guinea. One of my very first across the pond trips was to Papua New Guinea. I was way back in there. So is there a particular region of the country you were in?
Yeah, our translation work was in Morobe province up in the Finisterre Mountains. So if you know where the city of Leh is, so it's we could see that city from up about a mile high in the mountains anyway.
Oh, wow. Okay. So when you say an undescribed language, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what is an undescribed language?
Yeah, so it's a language that no linguist had ever worked with. No alphabet existed for it. This particular group, the Mamunda people, number about 2,000 people, and they're just so remote that they've never had any ability to be taught how to read and write in their own language. So our first job is just to learn a language without having a language in common with them, just through the tools that we learned in school, study and learn to speak that language, and then help them to create an alphabet and teach them to read and write as a precursor to having Bible translation.
Wow, that sounds incredibly challenging for many, many reasons. So, Brian, would you tell us a little bit about what you were doing, and maybe part of that could also be why Amarillo?
Yeah. Well, my wife and I returned back to the U.S. Nearly 5 years ago, and we just started back in Amarillo because my wife is from here, and we just figured it would be kind of a re-entry point, let the kids meet the grandparents and all that. But pretty quickly, we recognized that there were a huge number of immigrants, especially refugees, who had come to Amarillo and began to call it home, due in large part to the meatpacking industry and low cost of living. And as we started, kind of asking questions, I started learning who was at work here, what churches were doing what, and I could see that there were many people with really good hearts working with refugees here. There weren't many people who had the kind of experiences Crystal and I have, and so we decided to jump in and kind of try to bridge some gaps and help train churches, but also build kind of a more holistic approach to working with refugees, educating them, connecting relationally. And so, that was in May 2017 that we actually formed the Refugee Language Project. The mission statement is removing language barriers, building leaders, and cultivating community. But honestly, most of our time is spent on the leader portion of that mission, meaning that we've kind of mapped out the leaders of the whole network of refugee communities and set communities in this region, and then we've identified the leaders, and then we just spend an inordinate amount of time with those leaders. And as we listen to them, we learn what needs they have, and then we respond with programs that are kind of culturally appropriate and nuanced to their particular.
Yeah, so for a lot of people who are listening to you right now, they probably might not have a context for Amarillo. I'm not from Amarillo. I've been through there a couple times. So kind of my Gulf Coast centric view of Amarillo is it's this kind of quiet little town, lots of farms and ranches sort of out there right on the edge of the prairie, right as you head up into the kind of the Great Plains area. You mentioned the meat packing plants. I mean, what is the scale? Is there a scale of how many people are there, refugees or internationals? I mean, what does that look like?
Yeah, so Amarillo is a very unique place because it's a small town, small town feel, just because it is so isolated from other areas. But it's got over 200,000 people, and every sort of infrastructural need it provides for itself. So because they can't rely on neighboring suburbs or anything like that. Right. It actually is a pretty great destination for immigrants because there's so much room to spread out. And I mentioned low cost of living, but it's more than that. I mean, in talking with African people in particular, they often talk about what a great place this is for quality of life because it's slower paced than you would find in Houston or Dallas. Mm-hmm. They really appreciate that. It reminds them more of their home countries in those respects. The fact that there are more people who are working the land that ties them in to their own heritage as well. And so there's kind of a neat marriage there between their needs and what Amarillo can offer. But it's also a really harsh destination because If you're not working in a meatpacking plant, there are not necessarily many options locally for upward mobility for refugees.
So probably one notable feature about Amarillo is the Big Texan restaurant where they have that not all you can eat, but it's probably more than you can eat challenge in, what is it, 45 minutes? You eat like it's 3 pounds of beef or something?
I think, an hour, something like that. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, understanding, I think probably one of the big areas of culture shock for Americans when they go abroad is how the meat portions and the focus on meat might change. And so I imagine internationals probably have a similar culture shock coming here, seeing how much we focus. And then, of course, with cattle and ranching being such a big part of the economy of Amarillo and its kind of cultural fabric, have any refugees that you're aware of been able to take on this challenge?
I actually have never heard of them taking on that challenge. I have heard of them visiting that restaurant, but I've never heard of a single refugee attempting that. It would be funny to watch that.
All right, that's your challenge before our part 2 of this this interview is to take a refugee there and see.
I'll have a go at it. Yeah.
See what they can do. So, it sounds like this just became a very natural part of your life in reintegrating into life in America, and then these doors kind of opened locally, and you've just moved forward on that. I would imagine, as in many places in the country, that what you're doing is a little bit kind of ahead of the curve chronologically, in terms of have people been doing this a long time? Have people been thinking about that? And that makes it kind of a risky thing. So what risks have you been taking in your ministry there in Amarillo?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do feel like most of the people that I speak to who work in similar activities in this country have overlapping stories, and I definitely fit that. I don't fit any mold. I don't have a normal job. No, I mean, from the beginning, it was a risk in that how do you fund something that is independent? And so I had to, approach my church and basically ask them to hire me, and ask them if I could, raise my own support. Would you hire me on a zero salary, basically? So it was an out-of-the-box way to approach the need, and so it allowed God to provide an out-of-the-box way. And I've never been wanting, so God has always provided in those 5 years. But I'd say the ongoing challenge is more that because I don't fit the mold, I can't advertise like I would have. Like when I went to Papua New Guinea, I was considered by sending churches to be a missionary. That's the word they would use. They would advertise me like that. I would be held up on a pedestal like that, and we would claim it in our own newsletters. But now what I do is much more nuanced, and I don't use terms like that anymore. And what that often means is that I find it harder to develop and garner support from churches who don't understand the nuances, don't understand what holistic ministry looks like. They think that, I'm not trying to live out my faith because I don't use the key terms that they're used to. And so it's a real challenge to educate people so that they can feel bonded to this and feel like it's doing something that they can support. And I encounter that time and time and time again, and that's a real challenge. Even in my own church, where I've spoken many times about what I do, still people have left that church just because I do it. Just because they, in many respects, they just don't know what questions to ask. They don't know what they're looking for. So.
Yeah, I know it sounds like such an easy thing to go, well, I'll just go to my church and ask them to put me on staff as a $0, line item and raise money. But that's actually, knowing a lot of people who've tried something similar, that's a surprisingly challenging ask, simply because it is very outside the box. I think for people like you and I and others listening to this, it's probably a very simple, sure, that makes sense kind of thing. But I think that's actually relatively challenging for the average church to think in that kind of way. But that's amazing that your church has done that. So kudos to them. So
Yeah, I think it's important to note, though, that I had a relationship with them for over a year, maybe 18 months, something like that, before I brought up this idea. And so they knew my heart.
No, I think that's key.
And that goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that's key. I see so many people, who come to my church, and I'm on staff here, and they want to walk in on one Sunday and present the vision of their idea and get funding and walk out the door, or they want 50 volunteers, or that there's these mountain type asks, which even being on staff and having been here a number of years, I can't do. I can't say, hey, we're going to do this, and 50 people, immediately volunteer. It takes a lot of work. And
Right.
I think that's hard for people who aren't connected to a church to get church involvement, because they kind of approach it very, very quickly. And I think that word you use, relationship, is really, really key for working with churches, where my encouragement to them is, hey, come get involved and people are going to want to work with you if they know you. And if you have a relationship with them, and that's what's going to draw them, not me standing at the front, hold hat in hand, asking for volunteers.
That's right.
So I imagine that this has probably changed a number of times. You have the word language in your title, and then you mentioned you're doing more leadership. So I think that happens with a lot of people, where we think we're going to do one thing, and then we realize there's kind of this whole and beautiful unintended outcome of what we started doing. Like we thought God was going to do a particular thing through us, and then it changed. Have you seen any unintended outcomes of your ministry there?
Yeah, nearly every day, it seems. I because my time is given to relationships with refugee leaders, especially, I find that often guides me in ways I wouldn't have expected. Over the last year, we've spent a number of times meeting with separate refugee communities and asking them questions. And as we have listened to their actual needs and concerns, it's completely disrupted our own goals. It's caused me to close down programs and readjust. It's made me less of a volunteer-oriented program and more relational still. And it's actually pulled me into business development, which is something I never anticipated. I didn't see myself as an entrepreneur.
Right.
But as I saw the gaps, I started to notice that in this city anyway, most churches, as well as other nonprofit organizations, their only paradigm is to help with language, with ESL classes. They don't actually see any other way to support refugees. And so I began to expand my view of what it would mean to serve these groups of people. And that means that I come alongside churches in more of a training role, but then let them do what they do well, while meeting needs that aren't being met. And so, that is not. Like you mentioned, removing language barriers was right at the front of our mission statement. And other than a couple little programs like a Somali literacy class we have, we've pretty much ignored that focus. Though we do achieve it through relationship, people are developing English skills. It is no longer our primary motivation for existing.
Yeah, I think that kind of interactive look on things. We could talk about the topic of contextualization, and so many people approach it as, well, I'm the scientist, and I've been studying this in a class, and my stance is somewhere here on the scale, and so now I know what's best for these people. But people can do it programmatically as well. We're at a church, and so we think, well, this subgroup in my church, they want this program, and then turns out when I start listening, I realize, no, this is me. This is my idea that doesn't necessarily fit them. So that's really neat that you guys are. Sounds like you'll have a very interactive listening model for what you're doing there.
And it pays dividends. Thanks be to God that He's given us that humility only because of experiences in Papua New Guinea that taught us, mistakes that we made that showed us how we often walked into a room and assumed that we were the ones with the answers. But when we do shut up and listen, it builds this deeper trust with these refugee leaders that we wouldn't have had any other way. And by having kind of an emotional intelligence, like a cross-cultural intelligence to listen well and to build rapport with these men and women, it's allowed us to push past kind of their talking points that they normally tell others in the city. They speak more deeply with us, and that often opens the door to new opportunities just seen otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So what are the greatest challenges to your ministry?
I mean, maybe the biggest challenge is staying motivated when we don't know the direction we're going, because we're often adapting and asking difficult questions, reevaluating. It does mean that we might have put a year into a certain activity only to scrap it, which can be really disheartening to those who have put in the most amount of time to carry that out.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say the most important thing for us is to cast a vision, a deep vision to enough people over and over and over again that they're not attached to the specific programs or activities, that they understand where we're headed relationally. And so it's just really important that people understand the why more than the how. And that also allows them to develop, even people in our own programs who are volunteers, to develop as leaders, because they know where we're going, so they can make difficult decisions without needing to rely on me. But I also, another big challenge that I already mentioned, just educating churches, because they often, what I find is, I'm supported by a number of churches, even locally, but the difficulty can be that they'll assume certain things and ask me to carry out certain activities that they're doing out of the goodness of their heart. That sometimes those plans of theirs will undermine my own goals.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's difficult to balance so many relationships. Maybe that's particularly true in a smaller town like Amarillo, but I imagine everywhere, you have to recognize that there are already players at work when you start a program, a project, a nonprofit, a ministry. You have to recognize that people are already doing a lot of things. And you've got to work to build a coalition, build respect over time, and help them to see your heart. And that often means being pulled into things you wouldn't have chosen to do. So that's a delicate balancing act for anyone.
Right. We had a similar thing in Houston where there was a church that, to their credit, they do an amazing job funding a lot of things, and they have a great heart for the city. But that also means hey, what do you think we should do about this? Really carries a lot of weight, because they are funding a lot of things, and every now and then something will kind of become a group project, and it's always kind of a sticky situation to try to say, well, this might not be the wisest way to do this.
Right.
So, you've already mentioned.
It's important that we walk. I just wanted to say real quick, it's important that we walk in prayer, praying in the Spirit, because I think there are times, and I've nearly had to take this step already. There are times when we have to say no, even to a church who funds us, even if that means that we lose funding, because we have to recognize that God provides, and in a story like mine, as I've walked in the Spirit, He's provided in abundant ways already. So for me to say no doesn't mean that even if I make a mistake, God's not going to pull out the rug from under me just because I make a mistake.
Right. And sometimes those mistakes God uses as part of the next chapter of His unfolding plan. He's bigger than our mistakes.
Absolutely.
I think for a lot of year one, it's really hard to say no. because there's so much kind of, you're pushing the ball up the hill and it feels like by yourself. And then finally someone goes, hey, let's push it with you, but also do this other thing. And it's really hard to say no because you think, well, if I say no, then what will happen? And so that's
Right.
such a hard discipline to say, hey, thank you, love you, but no thank you.
Yeah.
So you've already mentioned, some of these kind of difficult interactions, or people in your own church that don't understand. But then, of course, as we expand out across cities and ministries, there's a lot of ways of doing any kind of ministry, but Muslim ministry in particular, and a lot of disagreements and now divides. How do you navigate all of these disagreements?
Well, one thing is I have a team of people. I mean, a board of directors, as well as a wife and some dear friends who know me and who are able to challenge me and call me out, and I can hear that and respond respectfully. So I think that's a safe place to be. I think it's easy for people like me who are trailblazers, who are doing new and out of the box things, kind of be lone wolves,
Mm-hmm.
which is dangerous. And so it's nice sometimes to just lean onto that team and say, I have to do this. They said I've got to. And when so much ambiguity is all around you, that allows you to accept those boundaries, allows you to feel safe. Also, of course, praying in the Spirit and allowing God to move you. But finally, I think maybe the biggest important thing for me when I wrestle with disagreements, even just disagreements in my own heart about how I should proceed, is that I routinely step back and I ask really hard questions about what I'm doing. I question the validity of the whole approach. At least once a year, I spend about a month reviewing everything we've done and challenging it, being the devil's advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's painful, but it's led to new growth. It's like pruning, and it allows me to like when you're a leader of an organization where a lot of people are involved and there are a lot of moving parts. It's just easy to get bogged down in all the daily decisions. So it's important to be able to take time and step back and see the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly.
Because that's what feeds into those daily decisions.
Yeah. I think that's another challenge for people in our kinds of ministries is that because we wear a lot of hats, for most people, they're bivocational. And there's just so many things needing attention that it's very difficult to take time to reflect, to assess. I think even in ministry in general, sometimes assessment feels like disharmonious or disingenuous, and people tend to shy away from analysis and reflection, and maybe coming from a more missiological and linguistic background, and you have a PhD, so you've done some research. Maybe that's what's helping you with that. But I think that's a key thing for people to kind of hang on to what you said there is just the importance of stopping and reflecting and asking the question, does this work? COVID hasn't been going on that long in my own life here. I've already changed approaches 3 or 4 times to, in the first 2 weeks when we didn't know, I was doing project A, and then the next 2 weeks, okay, it's going to be a while, so let's start something longer term. Okay, now it's kind of things are opening back up. How do we shift again and sort of cut some of the dead weight that I've picked up on, commitments and everything else? And so it's a challenge, but I think that's a key thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
So, to go back what you said, returning from Papua New Guinea, very clean identity. I'm a missionary. People give to missionaries. You're overseas. That's where missionaries go. Now you're back home. There's a lot more nuance. Who are you? What are you? That's a question for your own self. That's a question also of how do you kind of message that out to people? How do you control the messaging? how do you navigate your identity between church and organization, Muslim friends, family? How do you make sense of all of this?
Yeah, it's such an important question to ask. And honestly, having an integrated identity, perhaps the most important part of what I do. It's what allows everything else to work. So I am in so many different types of rooms, so many different audiences with people who, if I use certain words, they will that they will all of a sudden have all kinds of baggage associated with that word. And so in every audience, every time I speak, I assume certain extremes are going to be present in every audience, and but I also, even in developing newsletters, we send out a newsletter every month, and we the electronic newsletter, and then a printed one once a year, and I give that out to all of my Somali friends. I mean, I've got them on the mailing list. They see themselves on that front printed page, so they love that. But I also I'm talking like very positively and affirmingly about them. When I was in Papua New Guinea, it was easy to say something about friends there and know that they would never see it, and so I could almost say something that could be taken like about their ignorance, for example, because they couldn't read and write, or other things like that. But it would never come back to me, and it allowed me to craft two separate identities, one back home and one there. But I no longer have that option, and so that's meant that I've needed to find ways to talk that are honoring to everyone in the room. It's also meant that I need to be serious when I talk about holistic ministry, that I meet felt needs. And I do that as a passionate follower of Jesus. And I'm not going to shy away from that truth. It is who I am through and through. But that compels me to be an agent for change, a bridge builder, peacemaker. And it means that I do things that a lot of people think belong with, your social service agencies, or I do things that people just can't understand, but I do it in the name of Jesus. And I want to be a blessing to the Somali community in this city. So when I sit down in their Somali tea shop every week and spend hours there listening to the Somali language and talking with imams, I'm not shying away from who I am, but I'm also not aggressively going after them. I'm building friendships, and I'm responding. They say, hey, our women can't read and write, and there's no one here meeting that need. So we develop a literacy class focused only on their women, right? And then I keep going into that shop. And not only do I go in, I bring friends. And I frequently do that. I meet people at churches or wherever, and I bring them into those shops until they have confidence to go without me. Because what I've seen is that the biggest barrier for a lot of people to take Christianity seriously, the biggest barrier between the Christians and Muslims is built on a lot of misunderstandings about who real Christians are.
Right.
And it would be easy for me to spend all my time in these Somali shops and then walk away, and they would think of me as different. It's important for them to see that I'm one of many by taking the spotlight off myself, being someone who introduces and builds a network of relationships that have nothing to do with me.
Yeah, even outside of navigating identity, I like that you're putting your identity in the larger identity of the church body. I think just from a mobilization standpoint, that's really difficult, where people get upset and they get excited about refugee ministry and they stand up in their church and say, "Hey, who will join me on this project?" And nobody says anything. And I talked to one young lady in our church like that. I finally had to say, "Hey, how did you get in?" She was really discouraged. I said, "How did you get involved in refugee ministry?" And she says, "Oh, so and so, one of our mutual friends, so and so just invited me to go help someone move. Turns out it was a refugee family. Then we stayed for 4 hours for tea after, and I thought it was really weird. And then we did it again the next week, and the next week, and then after a while, I started loving the long teas, and I said, okay, you have to be that person to other people. If that's how you got in, you didn't join the work by some, broadcast announcement. It was somebody just going with you and kind of, holding your hand
That's right.
while you did it. I think that's so important. So I'm
Perhaps the biggest important program that we've had was called Table Talk, where we brought different communities together over a shared meal.
nice.
And I would teach a lesson, but it was never about language. It was more about culture. And so when we would have those meetings with the Somali community, I would teach a lesson, for example, on leadership and decision making. And I would share a Somali proverb. Parkelia Folomadakto was one that they all know. But I didn't share it with words. I went up there with mud on my face and began to wipe it off one finger at a time. And they all began nodding their head and looking at each other. And they recognized the proverb I was acting out. And Parkelia Folomadakto means only one finger cannot wash a face. And we have to work together. We're all separate fingers. So that was a precursor to talking about decision making and leadership. And then we brought the mayor in who addressed them. And I introduced these Somali men to the mayor. Now it's 2 years later, and yet that story is told almost every time I'm in a room. And it affords me this respect, this fame almost in the Somali community that this relational wealth, because they know that even though they disagree with me theologically, they know that I'm here for their good.
Mm-hmm.
They know that I'm listening, that I'm learning their language, and so that's just so crucial.
Yeah. How do you maintain a healthy work-life balance?
Yeah, that's a challenge. My pastor once told me that in leadership you're going to disappoint a lot of people, but let your family be the ones you disappoint the least.
Yeah.
And so I carve out time for my family, and I think after many years working in cross-cultural ministry, I recognize at this point that those seasons come and go. There will be seasons where it feels like I'm busy every day of the week, long into the night, attending this wedding, that funeral, or
Mm-hmm.
this Ramadan or whatever. And so that means I need to be operating at a surplus. It means I give my family the time that I have, an extra when I have it. That's really important. And also, we already alluded to this, but we learn to say no
Mm-hmm.
far more often than we say yes.
Right.
And if you're not completely convinced that an idea is good, then it should be a no. And I've found that so far, when I say no a lot, it keeps me free. And there's a tension when I'm not doing something that I could be. There's tension, but it often frees me up to be ready for the next big thing, which is far more important to be ready for.
Mm.
Now, of course, that's easier said than done, especially in the first year or two,
Right.
when you feel the need to prove yourself. And I think that's just par for the course at the start of a new thing. You have to recognize that there's that stage, but as you develop some trust, you're able to say no. Because often our own success will undermine us. Like when we succeed, we are then called into more meetings to be involved in more things, which takes our focus away, which is what allowed us to be successful in the first place. So it's just easy to become clouded and crowd our time so that we're not available for the Lord's direction and whatever He wants to do.
Yeah. I think that whole thing of disappointment in year one, we keep hitting these themes in this call and with other callers. Steve, several weeks ago, kind of mentioned the same thing about kind of there being a competitive spirit in the city, and that kind of leads you away from kind of personal health because you think, well, I have people who are funding me that want reports, and I have to prove my model and all these different things. And I think there's a lot in common with starting these ministries if we're not careful, where we can kind of take a secular approach in terms of how we view our time and family and everything else. I love your quote about disappointment. There's one from a book on leadership. Nate got me onto this book. It's called Canoeing the Mountains, and Todd Bolsinger is the author. He says leadership is disappointing people at a rate that they can absorb. And I think that's if you disappoint them too fast, they just get discouraged and wander off. If you don't disappoint them at all, you're probably just letting the tail wag the dog. I mean, that's a perfect analogy. So I'm sure you have many stories, but we would love to just hear one story from out of Amarillo of what does this all look like for you?
Well, I mentioned that Table Talk program, and the reason I'm excited about that is because it's allowed relationships to build with people in the city, with the Somali community. But I myself have focused a lot of my attention on one person who happens to be a medical doctor from Somalia, and he and I have become really good friends. And over the years, we've had this system of exchange. He teaches me Somali. He buys me tea and coffee every time we get together, but I tutor his kids. And I tutored him through an MBA program, and he comes and helps me teach about Somali culture in local schools. And we just developed this deep friendship where we work to help each other. And he knows my heart and what I'm about. And I've often tried to help him understand why I do things the way I do them, and help him to see kind of the bigger picture. Often try to just live out my relationship before God in front of him, even when things are hard. But I can only go so far because he and I have different beliefs, and so we have we just, there's a point where we seem to be able to go no further. Last year, I was on my way home one night. It was late, almost 10 o'clock at night, and I'm driving home, almost home, and I see two women with head coverings out on the side of the road with a broken down car. And I was praying at that moment for my friend. And I'm praying for him, and I see these two women, and I just thought, I don't know why this is connected. Normally, I'm not actually the type of person who pulls off to help people, but in this instance, I did. I pulled off away further, recognizing them as looking Somali. I started walking back toward them and calling out in Somali so they wouldn't be afraid of me. And then one of them starts running up to me saying, Dr. Ryan, Dr. Ryan. And I realized it was this man's daughters.
Wow.
Of all the people on the side of the road it could have been, it was this man's daughters. So I called my father-in-law, and he helped me change their tire. I went to the store and bought a part, and we got them ready. And what's really interesting is that right before I had pulled off, there was another man who had pulled off to help them, a Somali man that they did not know. And they said, as soon as I showed up, they sent him away saying, no, our uncle is here. And he was just really perplexed. But my relationship with that family was deeper than his, even though he's from the same country.
Yeah.
And then my friend arrives on the scene, and he looks at me, and I look at him, and I just said, seems like every time you need something, God sends me to you. And he just tilted his head to the side and just kind of looked at me in a new way.
Wow.
And I tell that story because of all the different activities programs that I've undertaken, that was probably the most powerful moment, and I had nothing to do with it.
Right.
All that was required is that I had the relationship, and then God arranged the line of schedules so that I could be there to bless him, to represent something to him about God's protection and provision for his family, about the blessing that he offers through me. And so I just want to encourage anyone listening to put in the time. I mean, that was 3 years into this relationship. Put in the time, because then maybe you'll end up on the side of the road with their daughter, maybe something even crazier, and you'll have the chance to do something really important.
Yeah, that's a fantastic story. I asked you the question. There are many ways to do things. How do you sort out disagreements? And I get the privilege to participate in many conversations about contextualization in Muslim ministry and strategy in Muslim ministry, and I'm kind of a rare bird on that level of conversation. Anyway, I think at the practitioner level, I'm pretty normal, but on that level, there's so much focus on speed and organization and management, which is not wrong. I'm not putting that down. I'm simply saying it is different. And someone was actually, it was Nate, listening to me and someone else kind of go back and forth about this. And he likes to quietly kind of process, and then he'll say something really golden. And he says, it seems like Brian's plan is focused on the non-tangibles, and if we take this other plan, there's not the same non-tangibles, right? We have a very expected outcome, and it's either a yes or it's a no, and then we move on and replicate. But I think your story really demonstrates that when we follow this other pace, this other pattern, and we look for the non-tangibles, what is God doing under the surface? Where's the Holy Spirit at work, outside of my levers of control, or my perceived levers of control? I think that's where we start seeing these very non-tangible things that we can't predict. You can't predict, well, if we do A plus B, it will equal, this guy's daughter's being stopped on the side of the road at this really key moment where I can minister to him. And, it just doesn't work out like that. So what do you think that you've discovered that other practitioners should know?
I mentioned this already, but I'll say it again. There are already other people working. And the longer that I've been in this space, even in a place the size of Amarillo, it is amazing how many different programs and ministries, educational institutions, churches that are doing many of the same exact things. And they all think that they're the only ones doing them. In fact, as I ask questions and visit, I realize many of them are actually doing the same things for the same people. And there are groups that are not being worked with at all. The harder groups, or there are reasons why certain populations somehow don't get worked with as much. Here, the Somali community would be one of those examples where not many people work with them, not with the men. They might work with Somali women who are willing to walk into their churches, but no one had any relationships with the Somali men. And it took me a while to recognize those gaps, to be able to step into them. And it took me even longer to speak authoritatively. It's for people like me who maybe have other experience. Maybe they've already gotten their feet wet in another country, and now they're looking to do something stateside, for example. It's easy to step into a room and assume that and you can tell people what to do, to kind of shake your head at the bureaucracy and red tape in a church, and to either anger them by doing your own thing, or turn your back on the church. And I would want to call people to a better way, which is to invest in the church and be an agent for change, building relationships, serving, serve as a deacon in your church. Be be a member of your church and disciple people to see the things that you see. And that is a long game approach, but it's so much more meaningful. And as I've introduced people in my church to refugees, their hearts have changed as they've built relationships, and then they are more able to speak to other people in the city about the nuances than I am, because I'm just the weird guy, but they're one of them, and so they can be bigger agents of change. So I want people, any listener, to recognize that you need to be someone who doesn't turn your back on other ministries, that listens to them, works with them. Go wash their dishes. If they've got an ESL program, wash their dishes. Serve them during their break time. Support what they're doing so that when God gives you the opportunity to do something different, they don't see you as a threat.
Wow. I think you're right. It's so easy to get caught up in always wanting to be the frontline person where the action is happening. And maybe this is well motivated, maybe it's, bad motivations, I don't know. But I see this a lot, and as I travel abroad, a lot of people will ask me, I might be talking with doing some training for young missionaries, and they'll say, "Oh, would your church support us?" And it's pretty obvious why they're asking me. Is there's this sense of I'm connected to some pot of money, which at our church I'm really not. We're kind of an inner city church, so I don't have some pot of money. I'm happy that I just get to go on the trip, but the broader issue, I sit down and I say, look, I'm just going to tell you no, and my rationale is, and I hear you. You're saying your church doesn't get it, and none of the churches in your country get it, and those churches aren't missional. That you're not just an ambassador to the people you want to go reach. You have to be an ambassador to your church, and that means you might not be the missionary that you think you want to be, but maybe a generation from now, there's 50 missionaries, young guys, young gals from each church. That because you were the one who kind of broke up the hard ground and stuck it out for the hard times, all of a sudden for them it's normative, and it's easy, and it's smooth sailing. And so I think that's a tough lesson to learn experientially, to not be the one. I know for myself, I'd much rather be going out there than mobilizing and training and supporting and all the stuff I actually do. But I do see that God is really using this.
Yeah, but it is a hard road. I'll tell you, coming back from Papua New Guinea, living nearly a decade overseas, it's difficult to walk back into a church here and see a lot of people who I call sleeping, who don't see their lives in connection with God's worldwide movement to bring himself glory by blessing the nations. They don't see how they connect to that. And, it can be really disheartening. And that's why most of my friends who have come back from places like Papua New Guinea, they often find themselves pretty disenchanted and often leave the church, stop doing ministry in whatever capacity, because it's hard. And I have been humbled by certain people speaking into my life to help me see it that way, because I was just like that, angry at the church, but that doesn't get anyone anywhere.
Yeah, we could probably spend a whole podcast just on talking about issues of returning from the field and trying to reintegrate into normal, whatever the new normal life is. But you're right, that's in our experience as well. Sunday was the hardest day of the week for us for the longest time. It took a while to really kind of come to peace with and heal and rest and so many other things. So if God would answer one prayer with a yes, what would you ask?
I can honestly say that I'd ask that he help me remain committed to bringing him glory, even if that means I have to sacrifice my own name, meaning the respect that I long for, that most people want. If I have to sacrifice my goals, in God's grace, I want him to purge my idols from me so I'm free to be a peacemaker, a bridge builder, a truth teller. I just want my life to make God famous and not me. And that's a scary prayer that I pray. When I've prayed it, it's come true, and I've had opportunity to sacrifice my own goals, my own respect that I felt was due to me for a greater good. And it's what I want deep in my spirit.
It's a good prayer. Well, that is all the time we have today for the show. Ryan, I've truly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for taking time and sharing about your ministry there.
Thank you, Brian, for the time. God bless you.
Yeah, you as well. Well, those were some great words of wisdom by Ryan. I really appreciate him sharing all of that with us. It sparked several ideas for me. I think that we need to have a conversation with several practitioners who've returned from the field and have gone through some of what he was talking about and just will share their experience. I know some organizations have that for their own workers, but many do not, or for whatever reason, people can't avail themselves of those resources. So this is kind of a simple ask. If you're out there listening to this and you think, well, I'd like to share my story or experience, go ahead and drop us a line at medinafocus@vision59.com. We'd love to put together a podcast on that topic specifically. Until next time, we hope to see you again.
You've been listening to the Medina Podcast. This show is hosted by Brian Hebert and produced by Nate Schultz. The conversations we have on this podcast are born out of an expanding environment of collaboration among grassroots ministry practitioners across the North American continent. If you'd like to engage on a deeper level, please email us at medinafocus@vision5